Unless you've been living under a rock, everyone knows that this year is a major election year in the US. I'm not sure if we have international people watching this YouTube channel and stuff like that, but for everyone that's living in the US, we've all been kind of like going through this like political strife with a country that is literally so divided down the middle that as of yesterday and the day before, so for those of you who don't know, the Republican nomination for the person that's going head to head against like the Democrat equivalent has been nominated as Donald J. Trump, former president, believe 43rd or something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. I really don't care. And then as a result of that, the Democrats put Joe Biden, the current president, as the equivalent of the Republican nominee, so the Democrat nominee, to go head to head in a political titanic battle. To anyone's surprise, I think it's very interesting because politics is something that has been very like galvanized in terms of like the past like couple of years, especially with like a previous Trump presidency, then Joe Biden, and then this year especially with people still fuming over these political ideologies, which essentially like breaks the country like down the middle. So as for the classic question of who is going to win in November, you ask anyone, it depends on who it is, right? So like some people say that Joe Biden's going to lose. Other people are saying Donald J. Trump is going to win again for a second presidency. Others are saying Biden's going to win and there's no way that the country would allow another Trump presidency. But the problem with that thinking is that, so the polls from what I've like seen in like the past couple of months can vary wildly. Like I remember a couple of months ago where the polls were saying that Donald J. Trump, his popularity goes through the roof the more the Democrats try to indict him. Versus now, where people are saying like after the State of the Union, I believe last week, because that was when the Taste of Iceland Festival was, Biden's popularity is now surging and Trump is now, being minimized in terms of popularity with the polls. But the problem with the polls is that it targets, it's obviously, as a poll is, it's a representative sample size, which is not all inclusive of the massive US population. And that's done for a reason, to obviously see like which state kind of favors which candidate going forward, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of the classic question of like who is going to win, it can honestly, like, it can go either way. I don't know. I mean, for me personally, I have talked to a large number of people in my life who work for the federal government here in DC, not just for the one that I work for, but in different agencies. And then I also talk to people outside of work who are part of the international community, and their responses are varied as well. People are saying Trump's going to win, and then people are saying Biden's going to win. Honestly, the way that I see it from like all the different responses is that you can't really you can pay attention to the polls obviously to keep informed and stuff like that, but at the same time, it's going to be a very close election. Like it's going to be 2016 all over again if I'm getting the year right. It's going to be such a close election. Like the difference might even be decided by a couple thousand votes here and there. It's going to be a really close like election for this year. But the point of this video is not to talk about like who's going to win and vice versa. There's a secondary aim for this video, which is to alert people who are in their early career stages or are thinking, you can be wherever you are for your like career-wise, mid, late, doesn't matter. But it's a word of caution if you want to work for the federal government. And we talked about career development in a bunch of previous videos with what you value the most out of a job. Is it remote working? Is it your salary? Is it your supervisor? Is it the people that you work with? Is it the nature of the work with? All these questions you have to think about when you're applying for jobs and deciding like what you want to pursue for a career. And so I got some very interesting response on that with like how it's very common for people nowadays to go from job to job after like a year, maybe not even in some cases, you know what I mean? And this video is meant for people that have an interest in working for the federal government, not just for one particular agency, but with relation to how election cycles will impact your type of federal job that you're going after. So, what do I mean by this? So, for example, certain federal agencies, like for example the Department of Defense, are not necessarily heavily impacted compared to other agencies that depend on funding, right? So, for example, defense is always going to be big because the US spends an absurd amount of money on military, like literally every year, compared to some countries in the world whose entire GDP is eclipsed by what we spend. It's absolutely insane. I forget the exact number of like dollar amounts that we spend, but it's like, it's trillions of dollars because the US maintains a very robust military that is used throughout the world, from peacekeeping missions to fighting in wars and stuff like that previously, So it's just like, it's very interesting because the nature of the administration is going to impact your agency when it comes to your work if you decide to get a federal job like I have one now and stuff like that. So for example, the Department of Defense is always going to be something that won't necessarily get impacted heavily by whichever administration is in power, from my understanding at least, and from what I've talked to like with other people and stuff like that. Like, Department of Defense is like a staple, you know what I mean? It's always going to be needed, it's always going to be there. Sure, the funding might vary from year to year, but I don't know, from what I have learned over the past couple of years and from what I've learned just by talking to people, DoD typically it has a good amount of turnover for its employees because of the workload, but you're always going to have a job in defense, you know what I mean? Just add two and two together. So certain agencies that are, let's say, environmental in nature, it's no secret that the Republican administration doesn't like the environmental side. They never have. They're all about big business and they're all about less regulation and etc. And the EPA is at odds with that. DOE is also at odds with that as well. So I caution you to think about which type of job you're going to go after, because depending on the administration, certain jobs might get cut, certain jobs might get boosted. It honestly depends on your location and the nature of the work that you do. So when it comes to applying for federal jobs, that's certainly a consideration that you need to have when you're applying, is you have to factor that into your long-term planning, because you don't necessarily know if your job is maybe moved to a different headquarters in another state, or you might not necessarily have the same job. You could get shifted around. It happens more often than you might think. So my point to you is this: depending on what type of job in the federal government that you want, look into the agency, see how they would be impacted necessarily depending on what type of work that they do and whether or not it aligns with what the next administration could be. I know we just said before that it could go either way, 50-50 if there's a Republican administration, or if there's a Democrat administration, just a change of the presidency and stuff like that. So ultimately we will see. But I believe that when you're trying to plan for your future and also the type of career that you want, especially if you want to work in the federal government, you have to think about these things ahead of time, because a lot of people are holding their breath as to whether or not we're going to continue with the same side, or if it's going to be a completely different administration with a completely different agenda. It happens, you never know. I can definitely tell you that in the future, certain colleagues of mine, for example, not at the agency that I work with, but just in other agencies that I've spoken to, they're planning their next year, the next 2 years, the next 3 years over what happens in November. And a lot of people are, because it'll impact your jobs, and if you have a family, that gets more complicated, and et cetera, et cetera. So there might be also a silver lining here for people that want to change their job. It depends, if you go on the fednews Reddit thread and stuff like that, that's a good resource, by the way, for those of you that want to get the scoop on what it's like to work in the federal government. Go to fednews, FEDNEWS, so fednews, and you can kind of see the general. Sometimes most of the stuff there is kind of turd posting a little bit, like, memes sometimes and stuff like that, but occasionally you'll see a golden nugget where, you can see, for example, like, what's it like to work in DOE? What's it like to work in DOD? What's it like to work in the IRS even? You know what I mean? Even though we pay too much in taxes. That's a joke. Depending on where you live, I certainly pay way too much in taxes. But it's just like, when it comes to the type of agency that you want to work for, go through those FAQ threads, frequently asked questions, and you can get a better sense of what it's like if people are happy, if people are not happy. You can also read reports, for example, that come out every year where they measure like the work performance of every agency, but then also like, the morale among the people that work there. Because let's be honest, without all the people that work in the federal government, nothing would get done, depending on how you look at it, with like employees and stuff. So the entire point of this video is not to, say that Trump's gonna win or Biden's gonna win. I have no idea. I just said that before. It could go either way. But in terms of your career, and for those of you that want to work in the federal government for the next 4 years, because we have to think about what new administration is going to be in place, what's their agenda going to be, what are they going to cut. Another big thing is federal funding. We can't, for some reason, we can't pass a full year's worth of budget in the federal government across the landscape. It's crazy. We keep on passing continuing resolutions here in the US, CRs. And for those of you who don't know what that is, from my understanding, a CR is just essentially a continuation of the funding from a previous months ago, just carried on. So they pass a CR instead of a full year's worth of budget every 3 to 4 months now. And then there's this whole debacle about oh my god, the government's shutting down, and one party is holding the government hostage, they have to negotiate, and then they go off for 2 weeks while, government contractors that are, not gonna get paid for a potential government shutdown have to wonder oh my god, can I pay rent? At least federal employees get back pay, but that wasn't even in place until 2019. So, in any case, I can go into this in a separate video and stuff like that, but for those of you who want to work in the federal government, I ask you this question. Think about what type of work you want to do, and how is that going to impact your livelihood going over the next 4 years, depending on which agency you want to work at, and then the agenda of the incoming administration. That's the question you should consider. So, like and subscribe for more. Handle is The Life with Nate and stuff like that, as we talk about various topics from career development to travel videos and just the nature of life in general and stuff like that. So, hope you have a good day.